Hey, good afternoon. I'm Michael Stabile of Tridium, and I want to thank you for joining us today for the second installment for our TridiumTalk Specifier Series webinars, Crafting Powerful Niagara Specifications. Today, you'll learn more about the process and tools we have available from Ed Merwin, Director of Strategic Business at Tridium. Please note we are recording this session, and it should be available on the Tridium website where you registered by the end of the day. Without further ado, here's Ed.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. So today we're going to be talking about the Niagara specifications, and you'll have to excuse our content is going to be really jam-packed, but I really want this to be more of a reference presentation that you can go back to, look at the recording. We'll also make the presentation available to you because it's got a lot of tips and tricks in it that I think will be valuable if you create any types of Niagara specifications. So again, just a little bit about Tridium, and we covered this last week. You know, we now have 1 million instances of software out there, 5,500 partners, and so many certified professionals that a lot of people are constantly asking us, you know, how can we better specify the Niagara framework? How can we add to our existing projects, and how we can do new projects? So I actually started working with consulting engineers creating specifications actually in 1982. And there's not a lot of, you know, today developing a solid specification has got some of the same principles that we had many years ago. It's really meant to be a team effort between the end user, the specifier, and the specifier's company, and the architects and others. And in many cases, also vendors, right? Buildings are getting very technical now, so we have to pull together a large group of people, and they all have a stake in writing a good specification. And again, it's important that we have this cooperation, regardless of whether what the product is, the technologies, the protocols. What we really are trying to get to is a clearly defined scope of the project. And again, that takes detailed coordination with various types of systems and equipment, whether it's drives, switchgear, fire alarm, et cetera. And of course, today's new smart buildings, we're seeing deeper integrations. We're seeing many more integrations to systems that weren't even software based, you know, 5 years ago. And one thing about specifications that I think is very important, we spend a lot of time talking about products and specifications, but in many cases, the execution doesn't cover all the details that it should. So I'm gonna cover that in a little bit more detail today about once we have the project and the product specified, how do we go about executing a good project, and how should that be specified? So, and then we also want to clearly define a method of commissioning and accepting the system. We're going to offer you a whole list of documents available to you to help you in creating specifications. One of them being the Division 25 design guide that talks about how to utilize our Division 25, what all the different pieces and parts are, and we'll cover a little bit more of that later. So let's talk about the different people. You know, the specifier can be a consulting engineer, it can be a technology provider, it could be somebody doing a design build, but the specifier really owns the design and has that overall responsibility to collect the needs and goals and really provide the technical expertise and be the primary author. You know, they've got to define the functionality that's required. They have to collaborate with so many people, not only within their own firm, but whether it's MEP departments, but now it's IT departments. It's working closely with the architects, all the different people that work on the project. And they also have to select the systems and the pricing and the value criteria. So, and then also, an important part is reviewing the submittals for compliance. You know, it's one thing to write a good spec, but if you don't make sure that the system as submitted is in compliance, you're going to have problems at the end of the job. And in many cases now, we're seeing consulting engineers participate directly in the commissioning and the acceptance of the projects, along with even other commissioning teams. I think the role of the specifier and consulting engineer, to me, has become much more complex over the years. The end user, they have a huge stake in making sure that they provide really good detailed requirements and needs to the specifier. It's very, very difficult. Sometimes specifiers don't have as much access perhaps to the owner and their facilities people as they need, but I think it's a really important part to be able to do that. And I also believe that the owner and end user should be continuously reviewing and commenting on the spec and design as it's refined. Waiting till the 95% spec submittal is way too late to make comments, I believe. The other thing the owner has to do is also provide reasonable budget guidance. How much are they willing to spend on the project? In many cases, that's done at a super high level with maybe the architects and the developers. But I think it might even get down to how much they expect to spend on a smart building system and what is their budget there. And because these can, be quite complex and frankly get quite expensive. And also the end user needs to define the roles and needs of all the people that are going to use the system and use the building. So they have to talk to the designers and the specifiers on the different people on their team and how they're going to use the system. They also may have some preferences. They may have preferences for vendors, for contractors, for protocol, for equipment, different types of systems, whether it's a VAV system, a VRF system, that sort of thing. So I think it's important if you're an end user to advocate for yourself and for your team and let the design team know exactly what you expect to have. And then also end users, I think, need to voice and fund their support for training requirements and ongoing proper operation. It's one thing to have a really great building automation, smart building system, but you need to be able to fund the support and the training in the initial perhaps set of documents in the bid, but also understand there's going to be ongoing training and maintenance that's going to be required for your system. Some facility executive questions. I'm not going to go through all these, but I think when executives are looking to build a new building, a new facility, or add to it, there's a couple of questions they have to ask themselves and their teams about what's important. How am I going to use the systems? What tools are required? Frankly, how many bids am I going to get? And more important, how many bids am I going to get when I expand my system? Another one, should I get the IT department involved and when? And of course, that one is right away. But there's a lot of things that a facility executive needs to understand as they go into a new project, particularly with a complex smart building. And now the equipment control and automation vendors and the system integration and contract community, they play a part as well in developing specifications. It's their job first to educate. Systems are changing so fast today. We're seeing new technologies in ventilation, different types of HVAC systems, IT systems, electrical systems, solar, wind. So their role is to educate the engineering community on these capabilities as well. And they need to understand the importance that their piece of equipment or their piece of the solution plays in the total integration of the project. So it's very important in the design stage for everybody on the teams to provide accurate and complete technical information. If I'm a chiller manufacturer, I need to make sure that the design team understands all the data that might be available, from my equipment. And also, what's the proper way to sequence my equipment? What's the proper way to shut down my equipment? What do I do in case of an emergency? And the other thing for the team of equipment control and automation vendors is to provide budgeting. And you need to refine the budget very often. Waiting to budget at the last minute at 95 spec, boy, that's going to cause some problems. So where projects and designs have to change. So we also have to always keep in mind that price is a component and it's very important. And technical information and pricing along the way, again, is something that needs to be done quite often. So what's some features of a good spec? Just from a specifier standpoint, fewer clarification requests prior to bid, right? You don't want a lot of requests for information, a lot of questions and confusion out there. You want to minimize change orders, frankly. You want to make sure that the original bid covers everything and there's not a lot of need for change orders unless it's a true change in design. And a quality on-time project will bring a happy customer and more reference projects for the specifiers. From an MSI standpoint, of course, I don't want to be excluded from bidding, hopefully, but I also want to know, how am I integrating a specific system? What other sections am I dealing with? And can I provide a very accurate, low risk estimate of my cost so I can submit the best solution and the best price, right? So good information brings, frankly, good, crisp pricing. And from an end user standpoint, I want to get the system I need. I want it installed on time within budget, but I want to make sure it meets the needs of all the employees in my building. I want to make sure facilities can manage the building better. So a good spec is good for the whole team. So some common spec issues that we still see today, and frankly, these are common spec issues that have been around for many, many years, is ambiguity. Ambiguity doesn't help. People have to make guesses, and that it always causes problems later. Sometimes the division of contractual responsibility can be very muddy. We have to make sure that all the spec sections and the people that are quoting those sections know exactly what their responsibility is. Also, we want to coordinate the integrations and get details. If I'm going to connect to a chiller, am I going to do it with some hardwire? Am I going to do it with a BACnet interface, a Modbus interface? How am I going to connect? We want to make sure we understand exactly how we're going to do that, because it's very important when it comes to getting accurate projects and accurate pricing. The graphic user interface, along with trending, alarming, tagging, analytics, and scheduling. These are complex issues. In many cases, we say, you got to provide a trend for this point, but we need to get down deeper in some of the details of how we handle charting and trending, how we work with alarms, and we'll talk about that. And now cybersecurity, user management, and the network are something that we didn't deal with 15 years ago, but we certainly have to deal with it on every project today. It's an extremely important part, and we really have to make sure that we beef up our specifications to include these. And again, I think the handoff is so important. There's many cases where we get to buildings where the customer doesn't feel they've had adequate training. They don't quite understand what they've got. It's a very complex system. So we have to make sure that we not only hand off documentation, but we are sure that there's good training. We pass along security and licensing info and those sort of things. So let's get started. Talk about some details here. So now the nice thing about Niagara is we frankly have limitless device integrations. Okay, we can go across the building, and frankly, we're seeing projects that are doing just this, whether it's lighting, central plant, metering, irrigation, refrigeration. But what that means is the more systems that we bring in to a facility and the more that we integrate, it means we need much more detailed coordination. It is essential that we do that. And also nowadays, we're seeing, when it used to be years ago, we thought it was going to be a protocol war between LAN and BACnet. Well, now there's so many more protocols that are out there that we have to deal with. We're not going to see APIs and protocols go away. We're frankly starting to see more and more of them of how we connect to devices and we connect to the cloud. So we have to be able to deal with that and be able to detail that in a specification. So let's talk about division of responsibility. For many years, 2300900 was the standard control and instrumentation control spec. That, along with the mechanical section, 2600 being the electrical spec, but now there's so many other divisions we have to deal with. Some of the technologies have separate divisions now. Even fire and security have been broken out in separate divisions on some guide specs. So who is responsible for linking all this together? Well, we can provide that with the Division 23 system integrator, who also might be having to do the temperature control, putting in the dampers and the actuators and those sort of things. But what's more common today, and we're seeing people gravitate to, is frankly using a master system integrator to do this type of work. So we still the Division 23 that might be putting in the VAV controllers, putting in the air handling unit controllers and those sort of things, mechanical, the electrical, and the other divisions. But now we're seeing where we have to write a specification for a master system integrator, reporting directly to the general contractor that's coordinating all these different divisions. And it really makes sense to do that. So this person has to have, frankly, the same ability to work closely with all the other divisions, and frankly, not be subservient to one division or another. So 25 was built for that reason, to quote directly to the general contractor and coordinate with the other divisions. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a lot of different divisions just within 25, right? In addition to what work you might see in a Division 23 INC spec as well. So how do we define points, and how do we start to define integration details in a specification? Well, for years, and I will say 40 years, we used a point list. Okay, very capable. We brought in points. It's necessary, but it may not be enough. There's a lot more available data than what we're used to specifying. We might have a variable speed drive that we say, yeah, we want to know the speed. We want to know the KW, but do we also want to know that there's so much more data about torque and about overcurrent and those sort of things. So we have to rethink, can we list all these points out, and how do we make sure that all this good richness of data that's available is documented? The point list is one way, but we frankly need some more ways to be able to do that. When we ingest data, a lot of it is now hardware points, and that's the way it used to be. Everything went in through an IO module and it was a hardware point. But today we have points that are software, whether they're coming in via BACnet or Modbus or some other protocol. You know, a VAV box, we might normally deal with 10 or 20 points, but there's 150 set up and different types of points that's available even in a VAV controller. So think about a plant controller or a chiller controller that could have hundreds of points that we may not need in day-to-day operation, but when there's an emergency, we may need to know what's going on deep within that piece of equipment. And frankly, the points that we use day to day, we basically call those linked points. These are points that are on a graphics, in a chart, in a trend, or an alarm. That's what we're used to dealing with. Day in and day out, we want to go look at that. But we often understand that rich set of points that's back there in the chiller or the VAV box, we can treat those as virtual points. These are points that we may only use while we're troubleshooting or tuning, okay? But we want to be able to have access to those points. So we have to rethink how we talk about points. An example might be a package rooftop unit that's got 30 day in and day out points that we use. However, there could be 100 points that might be useful for tuning and troubleshooting. For a technician in particular, it might be a graphic that only a technician has access to, but it's got things like suction pressure, discharge pressure, damper torque to see if the dampers are actually pushing the dampers open, those types of things. So we have to think about all this data that's available to us and make it easier for people to do things when it's an emergency. It's easy to create points for day-to-day operation, but what happens when it's some unique situation that we need this extra point? So how do we do that? You know, how do we go about bringing in a typical job that could have 10 or 20,000 points in an office building? Well, I think we have to first plan out what are the things that we actually want to connect to, and what are the individual items that might be in a building system. And this is just an example of something we call the facility integration matrix, and we'll make this available to you as a tool. But the first thing is the network, right? How are we going to deal with that? Who's going to, you know, what is that system? Who is going to, is it specified, and who is it furnished by? Well, it may be the owner, and the protocol is TCP/IP. But then what do we do? Even though the owner's providing that network, what does Division 25 do? Well, they make the final connections to the network device. What is it? There might be a network contractor involved in this. So what do? They have to install the LAN, the cables, the switches. Well, and Division 26 has got to get power to all that, but they also might be the people that are actually running the cable, right? And they are the ones that may be providing the LAN drops and the cable connectors and those sort of things. Other items might be just the Niagara web supervisor. It's provided by Division 25, but is it going into a PC or server by the owner? So as you can see, we want to list all these different capabilities and these different types of options that might be available to us. Now, this might be a tool that we actually publish on a spec. I've actually published these on documents and drawings, but it might just be an internal tool for the team to use to keep track, to make sure each one of the spec items has these covered verbally. I frankly like publishing this in the documents and refer every division to this tool on the drawings. Another one might be, I'll give you an example of lighting control. You know, it used to be lighting control was just a couple of relays on each floor turning the lights on. Well, now lighting control systems are extremely, extremely complex. Now we typically see them provided by Division 16 electrical, but we have to interface with all that in Division 25. So what is the appropriate protocol going to be? Some of them are using BACnet IP, some use Modbus. I've recently run against some that only provide limited BACnet capabilities, so you have to go to a custom API in the cloud to get that data. So we have to make sure that we understand that in the design stage, because this Division 25's got to integrate the lighting into the Niagara supervisor. They got to program graphics, integrate occupancy, provide indications with local HVAC zones. So 25 and 26 have to work closely together. The Division 16 electrical contractor has some programming to do. You know, Division 26 isn't used to doing a lot of programming and providing network information and details. But the lighting system, somebody has to program it and push that data out. So we need to make sure that's clearly specified in 26, and also specified that the MSI in Division 25 and the vendor in Division 26 are working closely together. And I think the specifier has to make sure that happens in their documents. So some additional integrations in the integration matrix, some ones that I think that we're starting to see a lot more of: tenant submetering. In one spec, I just saw the Division 23 had to provide the tenant submetering, not the electrical. So they actually had to provide, you know, a Modbus TCP and connect it into the JACE and get it there. But the Division 25 master system integrator had to provide all the graphics and had to make sure the JACE was able to ingest that information, that it was accurate. So Division 23 had to actually, because these are smart meters, had to do some commissioning directly at the meters. Okay, a little bit of software that had to be touched there. And then Division 26 certainly had to install the meters correctly to make sure they were wired up and installed close by the switchgear. Another unique one that I'll talk about is user experience or digital signage. Happen to have one where the user experience wanted to have all types of HVAC, occupancy, parking data provided for kiosk around the building. So as part of Division 25, that information, we had to ingest all that information, but we had to push that data out to a user experience team that created custom dashboards and kiosk and signage throughout the building. Okay, a lot of deep coordination that needed to be specified. However, it was furnished by the owner. Another one is parking systems, more and more. One where the parking system was being provided by a parking contractor, but the idea was to integrate that parking data so people could look at kiosk and say, you know what, the parking lot is full, or it's taking 30 minutes for the cars to empty out of the parking garage at 5 o'clock. Maybe I'm going to wait before I go out there and leave. So these are the types of new integrations that need to be specified very clearly, or at the end of the job, it's going to be a lot of confusion. It's going to take a lot of extra time, and there's going to be a lot of finger pointing about who provides what. So what are some more key spec components? The first one, of course, is open systems. And last week, Michael did a great job of talking about open licensing and access using the Niagara conformance statement or the NICS. We certainly, but the key thing we want to make sure is we have spec language, this spec language in our guide specs, which we do, but we want to make sure the contractor, if doesn't install any brand specific software on top of Niagara that might not be accessible to any brand of Niagara tools or anybody that might come in the future and use that. So you have to be very careful if you're going to put custom software on top of Niagara. Is everybody that works on that system in the future going to be able to use that specific software? Got to be a little bit careful about that in an open system. Also, today, not only is there building automation software, Niagara software on site, but every VAV controller, plant controller might use a separate programming software in order to code or configure their VAV boxes. Now, today, many manufacturers make their software available within the Niagara framework as modules so that you can use your standard Niagara tools to program VAV boxes, to program equipment controllers. So there's others that while they're not built into Niagara, they can connect into the JACE and can tunnel through the JACE and program the controllers. So the specifier, the owner, has to make sure they know what tools they're going to have available. Preferably, they would love those tools to be in the Niagara framework so they go to one tool set to be able to program everything from a fan coil unit up to the web supervisor. So that's a decision that needs to be made early on in the process. But the main thing too is at the completion of the project, you can have the most open system in the world, but if you don't have the login credentials to your system, the user admin usernames, passwords, and passphrases, you may be locked out of your system. So you got to be very careful to make sure that you have the Windows passwords. If they're going into the VM, you've got the station passwords and platform credentials for Niagara at an admin level. It's extremely important that you get those. So let's talk a little bit about graphics. The graphic user interface, there's a lot of different ways that you can program graphics. A lot of specs out there may say provide one graphic per air handling unit, chiller, et cetera, and that's all it says. And that's not enough. They've got, and many times graphics are usually built for a very technical user. But we also have to think about, that's true. If there's a technician in the building, they want everything on the graphic, but you might have more diverse users that don't need to see that. The energy manager may need a set of key graphics that only talk about energy. They don't care what's going on behind the scenes in the chiller. Okay, so the graphic view should be based on the role of the user. Could be even the CFO is going to have action or see activity about what is it costing them to run the building. So they need access to things about runtime, but they also prefer, how much is this runtime costing me? How much per day is it costing me to run my building? So, and we have the capability to do this. So we have to be sure that anything that we might do, colorization, spectrum objects, embedded sequences, they're very nice features and logs and charts, but they got to be specified if you expect to get them. You shouldn't have to build the GUI after the job is handed over. And the other thing is, all graphics today must be responsive. You should build one graphic and you should be able to see it on the big screen that might be in the facility manager's office. It's got to be on a tablet, a kiosk. And frankly, today, it has to work on a phone, on a smartphone. More and more technicians are abandoning carrying around PCs. Nobody wants to climb up on a rooftop with a PC if they don't have to. They'd much rather take a tablet or a phone with them. So we have to make sure that we specify graphics to be responsive and work with multiple types of devices. We also have a Tridium graphics design guide that we'll make available to you that talks about how you might set up your graphics, your hierarchies, and those sort of things. So again, but responsive graphics are extremely important as a graphic user interface specification today. Just some more, there's a couple of ways we can specify graphics. We can have a graphic schedule that's more than a checkbox. It's got to have a detailed description of the library and the functionality. Some people actually publish what the graphics should look like, and that's one way to do it. You also have to declare what's your graphics library. Do you want to use standard Niagara graphics, or do you want to use a third-party set of graphics? Many cases, owners now have created their own libraries and standards. I see many universities, and particularly I've seen a lot of school districts that now said, this is our standards. Here, we're going to give you our standard graphics and you add the points to them. So I think it's great for owners who want to create that owner library and standards. I think it's very important. But if you don't have that, you got to be very careful to specify what you're going to get. You've got to provide a navigation methodology, whether it's tree, navigation buttons, and then, of course, access. Does somebody have capabilities to read and write? And we'll talk about users in a minute. Now, there's another way you could do this, is that in your bid documents, you can draw out every single graphic, or you can specify that you just want to establish a graphics budget used by Division 25. And you give them the number of graphics, the minimum number of points, and navigation. An example might be that you're going to have each VAV graphic, and there's going to be 500 of them, shall contain 25 points, a sequence link, an O&M manual link, and link to a detailed set point page, animated fan, three-dimensional ductwork. And then later, okay, you can say, I'm going to work with the owner and the consultant later, and we're going to actually fine tune what those graphics look like. So the end user, the specifier, and the SI meet in a graphics development meeting and make sure that everybody understands what the graphic and the hierarchy looks like. Because what I've seen too many times is an SI will go through, do all the graphics hierarchy, do everything for the owner, and then they say, well, that's not really what I need to operate my building. Well, then that's a question of, well, who pays me to redo the graphics and those sort of things. So I'm a believer in either very, very detailed on your documents on what types of libraries and what you use, or you set up this budget that tells everybody, we're going to get together later, but put it into your price to build these graphics with this many points. And again, a 4-hour meeting can save a whole lot of changes. And I've seen this to become very effective. So you can also add the points and graphics on your integration matrix. So you can say, okay, we talked about the, let's say the fire alarm system. It's going to be provided by Division 26. There's going to be 1,000 approximate points, and then you want to show the fire alarm data on all the floor plan graphics for each floor. But also you can add one key fire alarm panel graphic that might have, key operational parameters like whether the panel's in trouble, what's going on with the panel, what mode is it in. So you can again use the integration matrix also to be additional definition for the graphics that you might use. Another way to ensure how you might get a user interface is to use something we call templates in the Niagara framework. Now, we've actually provided a lot of training. We actually have some very nice presentations on YouTube on building templates in Niagara. But what you might tell somebody is, regardless of whether you use existing templates or new ones, we want you to use Niagara-based templates on this project. And these templates are a containerized set of configured data tags, graphics, histories, alarms that can be deployed as a unit based on a manufacturer's controller. So think about a VAV box controller from Johnson that if there's a template built for it, when we go out and do the learn, the SI says, that's a Johnson's number such and such, boom, apply this template to it, and it's got all the information already there. Now, those templates might already be built in a library that the owner has, or you might have to build new ones for the project. But I really encourage in specifications, if they're to require the SI to build these templates out so that you can reuse them on later jobs. They're extremely powerful, and they'll save you a ton of time later, particularly if, and you might, it can be by brand. You can say, here's a template for the Johnson VAV controller, a template for the Honeywell controller, template for, the KMC controller. So the whole idea is building these standard libraries for future use. So let's talk a little bit about cyber management, users, and audits. One thing that we put in our guide spec now is no matter what, when you're doing the installation, the programming, it should be in accordance with the latest revision of the Tridium Niagara hardening guide. And these are best practices for setting up a secure Niagara supervisor in Jace. These are extremely good documents, and we're going to talk about much more of this later on Wednesday, the 12th, with Kevin Smith and Fred Gordy going to talk about writing cyber secure specifications for buildings. So I encourage you to really spend some time where we can get into details. The other thing, though, within Niagara, there's a security dashboard, and there should be a security dashboard set up for each JSON web supervisor. It automatically works, but you have to actually enable it. So that's part of our standard guide spec. The other thing is audit logs. Anything that an operator might do, changing a set point, changing a schedule, override a system on, that is audited in the Niagara framework. But you have to set it up for this particular project. So you want to enable audit logs and security logs in all your systems. The other thing that owners are using today in bigger systems, they don't necessarily want to set up passwords and user credentials in the Niagara framework. They want to link that to their existing Active Directory and LDAP. You take a lot of large school districts, universities, end users, they've already built in accessibility in their own IT system, and they want to piggyback on that. And the Niagara framework has the ability for you to use the credentials that are already built into an LDAP and Active Directory. So that's something that you have to discuss with the owner prior to doing the spec. Some language might be provide unique credentials for up to 25 users with roles and permissions provided by the owner. Regardless of whether that's with LDAP or regardless of whether that's built in, you never know how many credentials are going to be needed, but you don't want to have to be at the last minute adding a bunch of credentials as the building's being occupied. So I think these should be done well in advance. And it's it's incumbent upon the owner to provide you those details of the 25 users and what their roles and their permissions will be. Alarm management. Wow, this is a tough one because everybody likes to do it differently, but it's very important to understand within the Niagara framework that we have something called alarm classes. We can classify alarms by the type of system: maintenance, electrical, HVAC, plumbing, critical, safety. And you can provide specific criteria for how each class is enunciated, routed, and escalated. So we have to understand that. So if an owner only wants certain plumbing, problems to go to the plumbing shop, well, they have to give you user permissions to be able to do that. So in the specifications, we should also call out that you have to set up specific alarm class information and give a criteria, say 10, to be provided by the owner, and say I have 10 different alarm classes at a minimum. Now, again, the owner has to provide that information. The specifier has to approve it and to get together to be able to do that. The other thing that I don't see used enough, I think, is alarm escalations. Critical alarms should be escalated. You know, a dirty filter, you get the alarm, okay, it's there. But when you have certain critical alarms that the heat has gone off and it's -20 below in Minneapolis, you want to be able to set up alarm service recipients. And when we send those alarms out, if they don't acknowledge them with a certain amount of time, that gets escalated to the next person. And that person doesn't answer it, it goes to the next person. So alarm escalations are extremely important, extremely valuable for your critical alarms. And I encourage those to be specified and set up things that how many levels you want escalated, who they get escalated to, and after so many minutes, when do they get escalated? So these are important things that don't get thought about a lot in specs, but I think they're very important information that we need to provide. Schedules, wow, schedules are something that they get on a point list, and you have a schedule for each air handling unit, but we have to think about how is the building really going to be used. The building may be used totally geographic, right? It may be scheduled by floor, by tenant, that type of thing. However, in many cases, we do schedules by system, the HVAC system and the lighting system. But we also have integrated schedules that might just be occupancy. So what happens during occupancy? Well, we turn on the lights, right? We turn on the HVAC. We might start doing some analytics during occupancy that we didn't do before. So we have to think about how are we going to do schedules for cleaning? If the cleaning people come in at a particular period of time, what is the amount of HVAC and lighting that we're going to provide to them? It may be a total custom schedule. The other thing is maintenance schedules that can be very powerful. You might set up a schedule that automatically goes through a generator test. Generators are very intelligent today. You can send it a test command and it'll go through. You may want to automatically schedule that in the Niagara framework. You may have other different types of maintenance activities that you might want to do. Okay, so think about the different type of schedules you need, and again, that becomes talking with the owner and the specifier to get together what the user's needs are. The other thing that's very important is master schedules. If there's a major event like a weather event that's going to shut down schools, many school districts use our master scheduling. They can go to one schedule, they can override that one schedule, and it feeds down to 100 schools and tells them, guess what? We're not going to school today, so go into the unoccupied mode. The other thing, it could be a weather event. It could be an ongoing sandstorm that we've seen out in the West Coast and in the Nevada area, where if there's a high winds and sand could get pulled into the building, we might close down the outside air dampers for a certain period of time. It could be a very severe weather event like we just saw, where we basically have to go into a weather mode where we make sure everything's shut off in the right mode and safe, because we might have some flooding. So the other things are special reoccurring schedules like sporting events and board meetings, and then these one-time events that just might be something crucial. So the owner and the end user need to talk about these prior to design and make sure they get into the system. The other one that we need to make sure is system backup. In the Niagara framework has some beautiful provisioning capabilities that, first of all, you want to make sure that it's always installed to the latest Niagara revision at the time of acceptance. But we also want to make sure that the Niagara provisioning service is set up to make sure daily backups of all the JACEs go to the web supervisor. And that could be daily, that could be weekly. However, that being said, backup should be on a constant basis, and also coordinate the backup of the OS of the Niagara supervisor to the owner. The owner may want to do database backups and backups of the Niagara web supervisor, and that needs to be coordinated and set up in the spec on how that's going to be done. The other thing is, I recommend everybody built in the specification. We provide software maintenance agreements. Our base agreement is 18 months. I really encourage people to put in the guide spec to put a 5-year software maintenance included at no additional cost to the owner. So we're going to be talking a lot more about networks later. Greg Fitzpatrick with Cochran Supply and Engineering has spent so many hours working with specifiers and consultants on OT networks, and he's going to be presenting on Wednesday, November 16th. Greg does a fantastic job, working at the network level and the things specifiers need to understand about networks. So look forward to that particular talk. So again, let's keep on moving. So more things have been added since the last 10 years: tagging, analytics, commissioning. Tagging and analytics, I'm not going to go into some deep details other than we need to worry about specifying those. And we actually can have spec sections within Division 25 that talk about how we're going to tag data, what types of fault detection rules that we want you to use. We don't want to say to support it. We want you to say, guess what? We want you to do an air handling unit, cooling and heating simultaneously detection algorithm in this project. Well, if you do, then you have to specify that. So Stephen Holicky with Tridium and Chris Larry with EXP are going to be talking about writing analytic specifications on November 3rd. So again, they're going to keep piggybacking on these rich aspects of creating really good specifications. So one of the things is the handoff, and I've seen handoffs done very well. I've seen handoffs done very poorly, but now we're starting to see more and more people during the startup and commissioning phase of hiring actually either the consultant to do the commissioning or third-party commissioning agents. One thing you might be careful of, though, in many cases, commissioning agents have told me they wish they had more logs. Some of them actually have gone to Niagara training so they can actually add additional logs when they get to the job to do the commissioning. But I personally feel that a lot of these logs for commissioning can be set up and we can be specified ahead of time. A lot of these commissioning agents really rely on good, rock-solid trending data. They rely on charts because those queries and charts can help show how well the building's operated while they're doing the commissioning. So we need to be thinking about that, and any feedback from commissioning engineers out there that we should add to our standard guide specs would be open to that. The other thing is training. Training specs always talk about the same thing. They're very specific for on site. And I think that's extremely important. You have to show somebody, how do you turn on the air handling unit? How do you set up the chiller? When does the boiler turn on? Those types of things. But I think also that every specification should call for some factory training. It's a good time, it's the kind of thing that people don't do later, but if you pay for it in the basic job and provide one minimum of one operator and one certification class, I think the owner will really appreciate that because they'll tend to use it. So I really do believe that training on site with the addition of factory training is extremely important in guide specs. So also the documentation that we hand over, we're used to handing over, electronic information on the sequence, the drawings, and the maintenance and operation. But frankly, those documents at the end of the job should be stored somewhere in the system, either in the web supervisor or even in the JACE. I like the idea. We have some very savvy owners that they link the M&O to the air handling units right on the air handling unit graphic. So if they're talking about the rooftop unit M&O, they link that right in the building automation system because it's easy to lose files. And if you build them into the building automation system, build them in as links on the graphics in the system, you're much more easier to get access to those instead of looking up some book somewhere, going to a separate website online. So I think it's very important to have links and graphics to specific documentation and job documents. The other thing too, we talked about, make sure you get those OS and BAS admin passwords in the handoff. It's the most important thing. Don't pay the final bill till you have them. I think it's very important that you get those and that you may provide those specific passwords to the BAS people and make sure they're loaded and test that out as part of the commissioning to make sure that your credentials work in every part of the building automation system. So we've got some resources available to you. We've actually got division specifications available to you in Division 23-25, Niagara Enterprise Security Guide specification for card access control. We've got a Division 25 design guide, a graphic standard guide. We talked about our facility integration matrix. We also have a guide specification for using our Niagara Edge 10 controller as an actual controller. So if you want to use that as a guide spec within 23 with others, we have a separate standalone specification for that. And then we also have our Niagara information and compatibility statement data sheet and presentations. Those are all going to be available to you on the Tridium website. You'll be able to get those downloadable on Tridium.com, and you can also make a special request to have a specifier get a person from Tridium get in touch with you. Okay, so we're going to make this easy for you to download as we create these documents and update them. You'll see quite a few of them by the end of the week up on our website. So again, we already talked about some of the upcoming series, and it's not going to stop here. We're going to restart again next year in February with even more. So we're going to continue the specifier series next year, and we look forward to your feedback to tell us what additional content you might want to get from us. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions, and my good friend Michael is going to cover those questions, and we'll both work on answering those that you might have. So put those in the Q&A box.
Indeed. Ed, we've had a few over the time here. Some of them have been logistical, which were some questions around when the presentation would be available, and from a standpoint of downloading the presentation as well as the recording. Danielle has already posted the presentation. It's up on our website where you register for the site. You can actually go in there to any of the sessions and do the downloads. The session recording will be available by tomorrow morning. We have some trimming to do and before we can post that, but rest assured that'll be available by tomorrow for you as well. So that's the logistical side. Other questions were about what you just covered, which was the downloading the documents. So in anticipation of us getting them posted, as Ed mentioned, on the Tridium site where you go into learn role specifier, there's a button you can click at the bottom that Ed was showing, and there you can ask us specifically for specification documents, or you can reach out to us an email, my email, michael.stabile@tridium.com, for example, and just ask us for the particular documents that you're looking for until we get those posted. So thank you for that. Ed, one of the questions that came through early on, I think you'll enjoy, which is, in our new world of smarter buildings, do you see specific KPIs and identified outcomes being included in specifications?
Oh, I think that's a great question. I do believe that, you know, everybody's talking about dashboards nowadays, and again, what are the KPIs? And I think those might be a separate, even integration matrix that talks about KPIs. You know, everybody's talking about ESG. They're talking about how much carbon are they using, but I still like things like how much is my chiller? What's KW per ton of my chiller running, right? So if I'm a facilities person, you know, how much electricity am I using per square foot of my building? Another KPI that we just did in the new Honeywell headquarters was monitoring noise. What are the noise levels in the building? We never monitored noise before, but that's become a KPI to make sure, you know, where are the noise levels? Are they acceptable? You know, is it because we have too many people sitting together and they're all in Zoom meetings and they're talking and collaborating and we have open office? So I truly do believe that there's probably a separate section that may want to do that talks about the following KPIs shall be provided, right? And again, I don't think we see that on point lists that often, right? And those KPIs again are becoming available from the APIs. I'm sure the chiller manufacturers offer those types of really good informations out of the chiller. Same goes for even some of the boiler manufacturers and rooftop units as well. There's KPIs we probably aren't aware of that we need to start specifying.
Great, thank you. I think we're pretty well. Anybody else? Oh, here we go. So next question came up is, do we have specifications or guidelines for allowing the exportation of building system data to an external data warehouse? There we go.
Well, that's a great point. And if you notice, we didn't get into details of it today, but there's new protocols, right? You don't use BACnet to export data to the cloud for the most part, right? You use things like AMQP or MQTT. And I think that's why on that integration matrix, I think that's where you would do that. The owner might have a third-party cloud application. Maybe it's an analytics, maybe it's an optimization program. And if that data has to get pushed out, we certainly need to make sure that the MSI sets up using proper protocols. How am I going to export the data? Am I just going to push it to a SQL database? Am I going to push it to a REST API like our new HTTPS driver? Or are you going to use, like I said, MQTT, JSON, AMQP? I mean, there's a lot of ways to do it, but you got to specify how. And again, that's that coordination meeting. So that's a great question. We probably should have another thing that I'll add to the facility integration matrix that talks about cloud applications, and so that you could pop those in there. I think there's going to be buildings that are going to have 4 and 5 different cloud applications connected to their building. It's not going to be one giant cloud everything goes to. So great question.
Okay, Ed, we got another one here that just came in. And I think you might have covered a little bit of this with the SMAs. I'm not quite sure where they're going here, but have you included licensing requirements in the specification, or are licensing costs generally handled outside of projects?
They're generally handled in the projects. When an SI provides a job to you with a JACE and the web supervisor, they're purchasing that license and they're transferring that license to the end user. So that's very common. Now, it brings up a good point. What kind of future expandability? You might have your first building that you're building, but you're going to add another 50 buildings. You may want to build into the specification that the system shall be expandable to add an additional 50 buildings or an additional 50 JACEs or an additional so many points. So I think expansion is something that is a very good point, how to handle that.
Okay. No more questions up there. We've taken 50 minutes. Congrats, Ed. I knew that was going to be a packed session. Here we go. Oh, we got another one. Do the specification documents cover trending requirements or control sequencing, such as guideline 36?
Great question, and I should have probably mentioned that deeper. Sequence of operation is one of the most important things that I think you can do in a good spec. So yeah, the sequences are always going to be part of the spec there and handled. I think like you might put in your specification, they're going to go after ASHRAE 36, right? Say you shall use ASHRAE 36. I still think you should publish the actual wording there. I think 36 is good, but I do believe that in many cases, there's people that have gone beyond 36 and added some specialized ventilation requirements. I can tell you, I worked with a local university where they actually increased the ventilation and added some ventilation sequences to pre-flush buildings early before students get there in the building. This was all, as COVID hit, and but they still utilize those today because they found, I think it's a best practice to do that. So I think the new ESG requirements, and again, we'll push that. But definitely within the guide spec, you can put your sequences. They might be in division 23 or they might be in division 25. But in that sequence, that's where you can add things like, by the way, you shall add this as part of the sequence. Your fault detection diagnostics should be in the sequence. It says you shall provide a diagnostic that says when any valve is leaking or when there's simultaneous heating and cooling. Those are things added to the sequence that I think we're going to see more of in the future.
Okay, Ed, here's another question I think actually brings up a chance to talk about Asset Manager. The question is there a specification around license management? And on a multi-campus site with multiple contractors, how can the end user own and manage their own license?
Well, Robert, that's a great question, and I think we don't probably do well. And I guess Michael and I better start writing a spec around that and how you manage licenses for an owner. So we'd love to have feedback if you want to provide any. But it's a great point. I think that today, first we want to make sure it's open. We want to make sure that people leave you with the proper tools. But you bring up a good point. If 2 different integrators have done 2 different buildings, how do you make sure that the software license agreements are pulled together, how they're synchronized? So that's a great request. And Michael, you and I have to get working on that one right away.
That certainly brings up the ability to use Asset Manager to see all of those and see where their licenses stand in terms of their agreements and current, whether they're current or not. So
yeah, I think, but a good point in the specification might be for an end user that says you shall coordinate and add these licenses to our existing, software maintenance agreement. There's a lot of language that probably could be added for coordination purposes that will make it easier for the end users, I think, in this case.
Mark's got another great question. Do we see more EV charging stations becoming part of the specs as they become part of the integration with the building systems?
That's a great question, Mark, because we're seeing more and more of it. Where they are in the specifications, that's another one that's very important, because I think what's happening, EV chargers are becoming like lighting systems. Some of them just give you a clean Modbus interface that you bring into the building automation. Some of the EV charging infrastructure has their own cloud-based connectivity. So I think now it's important, and we're seeing more and more of it, particularly distribution centers and everybody's even convenience stores are putting in chargers now. So I think more and more we're going to have to start specifying that whether the charging station is provided by Tesla or somebody else, we need to have an interface there because it's important. One, how much current is it drawing? Is there any safety connectivity there? So I do believe that the capability is certainly there. We talked about it at the Niagara Summit. We know that that LinkSpring has worked with some EV manufacturers as well. So I think it's going to be more and more, it's going to become more common, I should say. It's going to be as common as the generator, as the drives and those sort of things. EV chargers will be in guide specifications. And we need to make sure we integrate with them properly.
Hey, one more question came up. Suggest that we specify third-party device supplier getting integrated must supply 5 years of.
Well, Bob, that's not I know where you're coming from, right? If somebody builds a third-party module and third-party support, I like that. I think we could probably add that in a third-party part of the spec of Division 25 that says any supplier shall support it. I think that's going to be contractual too as well, which will mean that the third-party supplier will have to give you some sort of software maintenance agreement through the SI to be able to do that. But I like that third-party device SMA, so to speak. It's kind of out of our realm, but I think it's something that we could put in a spec that might help cover that. Like a third-party SMA requirement.
Yep. And folks that didn't get the gist of that, it was that there are certain jar files or capabilities that people might write for Niagara. They just wanted the person asking wanted to make sure that they were forward compatible to future versions of Niagara. It's supported that way. So as Ed was mentioning, that's in the hands of that third-party developer and a relationship between you and that developer. I
mean, we have a great community that do some really nice add-ons to Niagara, but it's a good point that we could do that. I think it's incumbent on the person to do that, but I think it is a good point that we say any third-party software, first of all, must be open and must have a software maintenance agreement that comes along with it via the SI. So I think it's a great point.
And a final great tee up as we run out of time here is asking if they have a large campus and they're moving from an existing platform to Niagara. Thank you very much. Any additional resources that we can point to would be very helpful. We certainly think we've engaged, and our team is available to engage with you to help with integration resources and discussions and possible other customer references, as well as introduction or assistance to your selected partners. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we've been doing this for 20 years and we kind of know how to do it because we've seen everybody have a different situation. So part of our role at Tridium is we don't do the install. We have a great group of partners that do all the install and the programming, but we certainly can help you in your journey, your roadmap, your specifications. That's our job at Tridium, to help guide you through that process so you can make the proper selections down the road.
Okay. And with that, we've pretty much come to the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining us and look forward to seeing you in our next sessions. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you attending today.